Back, let's take you here now. Today marks the first democratic elections held in South Africa on 27 April 1994. As the country commemorates this day, we reflect on how far the country has come. The IEC has embarked on a campaign to urge young people aged from 16 and above to register to vote. Now, the previous general elections recorded a very low voter turnout. It's said that almost 30 million South Africans were registered to vote, while youth votes accounted for the least, as young people were pessimistic about the changes their votes can bring. Now, let's discuss this further. We are now joined via Zoom by the IEC's Chief Electoral Officer, Mamabolo. We are also joined by Karabo Mokgonyana, a legal and developmental practitioner and a program director at the Sesi Fellowship and a Skill Hub. Good afternoon to you both, and thank you so much for making time this afternoon. Sai, perhaps let me start with you. There are concerns that even though, close to 8 million youth have registered to vote for next year's election, but that like the 2019 national elections, youth votes will yet again could possibly account, for the least. Talk to us about how your current voter education drive that you are doing at the moment is going, and what your fundamental message is, to the youth, just given youth voter apathy that we've been seeing in the past couple of years.
Well, we act out of the realization that a democracy that does not involve young persons is going to get stale, and eventually it will die down. So it's important that the young within our society are engaged and, in fact, take electoral democracy seriously. Our campaigns, which we've already commenced with, we launched a tertiary civic and democracy education within the tertiary sector that we launched at Rhodes in March. We're going to be visiting all institutions of higher learning to ensure that every young person in those institutions is engaged in terms of civic and democracy education, as well as given an opportunity to register and be on the voters' roll. The second level is the schools democracy education that we currently have. We launched that in Rustenburg about 2 weeks ago, and provincial launches are now unfolding. With these two programs, again, we intend to engage with young persons, to engage them in a democracy and civic education conversation, which then leads them to register and being on the voters' roll. But that's not all the effort we are putting into this. We also launched the online registration campaign on social media. This is important because young persons in the ordinary course of their lives, they engage politically on social media. That is where the conversation, the civic and democracy education conversation must also happen. But it should not only end there as a conversation, it should result in them enlisting to be on the voters' roll. Once they are on the voters' roll, young persons who are registered tend to participate in high numbers. So the challenge is not so much whether they go out and vote if they're registered. The greater challenge is to get them to be on the vote.
Karabo, let me bring you into this. Of course, just listening to what the IEC is saying, and I know that, Sai, your connection seems to be not so great at the time, but let me bring you in, Karabo. You penned a thought piece recently, largely about just how crucial it is, that the youth participate in civic and political matters, as we're hearing now from Sai, particularly as we reflect on just how the freedom to vote was a hard fought for right. Where do you think the voter apathy stems from, especially when we talk about a sector that accounts for a substantial number of potential voters?
Thank you so much. I definitely want to just say, happy Freedom Day to fellow South Africans. I think when it comes to the apathy generally, the lack of civic education aspect is definitely an aspect, and I'm glad that the IEC is doing something about it. I do hope that there is an extension into, other spaces that young people are in, not just the educational spaces. So young people are definitely on social media, young people are at parks, taverns, that's where we are at. The informal, hard to reach areas that we barely see these sort of campaigns within. But when it comes to really the apathy, I think it's bigger than just civic education. There is a bit of a gap in terms of trust towards the electoral and political process and whether it's working for us as young people. Because when it comes to the issues young people face and whether even having young people on the ballots and the candidate list, there is a bit of a gap there. So representation is very much not necessarily there when it comes to people being included on candidate lists or being considered and running for the electoral process in itself. But also then, I think there's a big yearning for ethical leadership. And unfortunately, that has not been the trend within the country. So young people are questioning, where is my vote going? What is the purpose of me voting? But also in light of then the issues that are going on. So we have a lot of unemployed young people. We have young people who are exposed to a lot of the criminality in this country, the GBV. A lot of their issues are not necessarily being addressed. So the big question is, if I am coming to the center and I'm voting, what is it actually doing? And as long as there's a question mark, particularly in the context of being a young South African in this day and age, and all these issues are not necessarily being addressed, then you question even the value of the electoral process and what it really means for young people.
I want to ask you both this question, and I hope, Sai, that you can answer it. Just talking about how well represented the youth is in the current political system, and just how inclusive you think the political participation can be encouraged, and to what extent does that, affect youth voters coming out?
Well, it is an aspect, but I don't think it's a totality of the problem. The problem is multidimensional. There's a CDE component, no doubt about that. But also there's a perceived lack of democratic dividend to young persons, as well as issues of representation. Our sense is that the world and the leadership of political affairs in the world is getting younger and younger. And we hope that political parties will factor that when they finalize the list of candidates, the issue of representation, as far as it pertains to young persons, but also insofar as it relates to other sectors of society, women. We've not done badly as a country, but we need to watch that we do not retard the good progress we've made since the advent of democracy. People who live with disabilities as well. So inclusiveness in the representation, it's a key element, but not the totality of the problem.
I'm going to extend that question to you too, Karabo, but I'll also add in the fact that we are hearing more and more voters across the board, whether you are a young South African or you voted several times. A lot of people are complaining about the narrative that they are, getting from political parties. For an example, they say that, come election time, what they are hearing from political parties is why you should not vote for the other party, as opposed to what this party will do for you, given the challenges that the country is facing at that particular time. Your comment on that?
Okay, so just in terms of the first thing, I think definitely, representation is definitely important, but also I think we need to move away from formative representation, and I think that's what we're seeing in the country. Yes, we are starting to see, young people within, the governance system and governance structures, but how equitable is that representation? And I think that's something that's serving to be problematic, because even though we will see young faces within, candidate lists or within parliament, a lot of the times they have minority power to influence policy decisions, to be able to basically represent the interests of youth at those sort of, at that sort of level. So we need to also then question if that representation is equitable, if it is substantive, and if those people who are getting into these institutions have the power to influence policy, to influence programs, to really influence, the inclusion of youth interests and youth problems in these sort of decision-making tables. And then in terms of just the representation that has been made by a lot of political parties, I think we tend to forget about public interest as we are politicking. And yes, it's expected that as they go through it comes with politics generally when it comes, the competitor way of actually canvassing and that sort of thing. And we can't take that away. But I think in the process, there is this neglect of public interest, youth issues as well, and what that actually means. And rightfully so, you're saying, what does it mean for me in terms of what this political party can really do? I think every young person has different interests. For somebody who's unemployed, what does your employment policy and your mandate really say? And what can that do for me as a young person who's unemployed? What does that mean for somebody who feels like there's no representation? So I do feel like public interest is neglected in the process of canvassing and trying to get young people to vote.
Karabo, as we wrap the conversation, just 30 seconds from your side. Young people have the numbers to bring change into this country. This is what I'm hearing. And as I said earlier, just under 8 million, young South Africans between the ages of 16 and 29 have registered to vote next year. What will it take for them to actually go to the ballot? Karabo, just as your final thoughts?
So I will say definitely the civic education needs to go on, because we really need to understand why it is important for us to firstly maintain our democracy, to protect this democracy, but also what our votes actually mean in the bigger scheme of things. But also just really our voices as young people matter. And I think as political parties go through their campaigns, they need to really bring that forward to make young people understand that their voices matter and that their votes actually contribute to the bigger mandate of our democracy, but also pushing public policy, pushing any sort of issues that we need to actually do, but also accountability. It is a form of political accountability for young people to actually decide who's going to represent them in these governance spaces.
Sai, just your final comments, is particularly in what you said earlier, young people have the power to protect this country's democracy. What will it take for them to actually go and vote? All right, we seem to have lost Sai Mamabolo there. But that's where we leave our conversation now. Thank you to both our guests who were here today. Of course, a very important question as we are asking, as we celebrate Freedom Day today. Those were my guests, IEC's Chief Electoral Officer, Mr. Sai Mamabolo, as well as Karabo Mokgonyana, and she is a legal and developmental practitioner, as well as the Program Director at the Sesi Fellowship.